Changing the oil in your bike is one of the most basic service items that you can accomplish on your own. It only takes a handful of tools really, and you can save yourself a lot of money versus taking your bike to the dealer. So we're going to change the oil here on the SV650. The only things we're going to need here: filter wrench. You can have the strap kind or these kind of go on the end. Either one work just fine. This is what I happen to have that suits my needs because it fits this particular filter. You'll need a 14mm socket to go along with your ratchet. That's for the drain plug. Next, you will need a pan to put the oil into. Something that you can pour out easily is nice. Most of these, frankly, are kind of garbage. The seal doesn't work well on the top, but as long as it works well on the pour spout, it's fine. And the larger the opening, the better. The less likely you are to spill oil. Roll of towels, always handy. I've never been able to change oil and not get oil all over my hands, so that brings me to gloves. Optional, but I prefer it. Next, we're going to need our oil filter. I prefer to get this genuine Suzuki when I can. Oftentimes the price is really through the roof on these, but if you can get a decent deal on them, why not go for the OEM? And then lastly, what you're going to need is oil. And we'll go over the particulars of motorcycle oil later, but this one takes 2.4 quarts, so we got 3 on hand. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start up the bike. I'll have it running with the door open, of course, and warm it up. So now the first thing that I've gone ahead and done, as you can see, is the body work is removed. It's out of the way. Most SVs, this isn't a problem. If you have a track bike as a belly pan, obviously you're going to have to remove that to have access to the oil drain. And next, and I've already done this as well, is warm up the bike. I like to have the bike warmed up. It does help the oil come out a little easier, and although it does circulate the oil as well in the engine, you'll get it out in a shorter period of time if you do this. So once we remove the drain plug, the oil will flow out more smoothly. So let's get started. So I like to start with the drain plug, and once the oil is drained out, then move to the filter. Now, if you have a pan that has a grate at the bottom of it, that is great, because you don't want that plug falling into your oil and having to go search for it. So that's a handy feature just in case you do drop it, or you can intentionally drop it. Saves you a little bit of grease on your hands, I suppose. So I like to push it in as I'm turning it out. And then once you feel that thread jump a little bit, then you know that it's all the way out, and then you can do your quick plug pull maneuver. Feel it loosening up, and that is definitely loose. So let's give it a go. Wow, this may be a first. No oil on my hands. So you can see it's coming out there pretty good, at a pretty good clip. It's not totally black because this bike really doesn't get that many miles, but the miles that it does get are hard miles because it is just on the track. So I like to change the oil annually. I probably get 4, maybe 5 track days a year on this. So I don't think I'm overstressing it with 5 track days on change of oil. All right, we can see it tapering off there. Now, here's a good opportunity to start inspecting things. There is a magnet at the end of your drain plug, and that magnet is there for a very good reason. If there are any metal shavings from excess wear inside your engine, they will show up there. So I can see that there are a couple of little ones just barely attached to the magnet there, so I'm not too worried about that. If there was a lot, then I would be really concerned. Now, one thing you can do if you're really concerned about an engine, maybe you see this, you can save your oil and try to keep it as much as possible without contaminating it any further as it comes out of the engine. But you can actually send them to a lab. There's a place called Blackstone Labs that will analyze it, and they will tell you what metals are found in it, because there are going to be some fine amounts of metals regardless, just the way engines work. And based on the amounts and composition of those metals, they can tell you what might be wrong with your engine, whether it's on a motorcycle or a car. That's some good insight. But I am not too worried about this. I'm not really even sure how many miles this bike has on it, but I would say it's under 15,000 for its life. For a 20-year-old bike, that's almost nothing, right? Okay, once this slows down to a drip, that's when it becomes good enough for me. You can certainly walk away and come back in an hour, and it might still be dripping slightly, but there's really not that much oil that's going to come out of it at that point. So what I am going to do to try to speed things along here is still catch that oil, and hopefully catch the oil from the filter as well. So see how that works, right? All right, so remember we are working on a warm engine, so the pipe might be a little hot. Just clear that. As you can see, it comes off pretty easily. A wrench should be required. That means it's on tight enough, but I don't like to really cinch it down. We'll get more back into that later. Now I'm able to capture the drips from both ends. And yeah, the drain, oil coming out of the drain plug is just to a drip right now, so it's really not draining much. So, hot tip here, when you pull your filter, pull it with the opening up, because there is going to be a lot of oil in there. That way you're not just dumping it straight down. And I just set it on the grate there. See what I mean? These things are pieces of junk. So, in my filter wet. No worries. We got it. We got it. All right. If you have an oil drain pan that you like, a particular brand, you got it from a particular chain or something, let me know. I'd love to replace this piece of garbage. All right, so I'm going to put in the drain plug. Do that finger tight. Always start with the fingers so you make sure you don't cross thread that sucker. One thing I can go over is the crush washer. There's a washer at the bottom of that bolt, and that can be replaced. I replace it maybe every 3 or 4 times I change oil. It's a good idea to replace them now and then, make sure they're not going to leak on you, but as long as you're not really getting them super tight, they should last a fairly long time. Now, I'm not going to give you a torque spec on this. The manual probably will, or maybe I'll just throw it up here. Get it tight. You don't have to reef on it. You know what tight is, right? Okay, and then for the filter. So the way I like to go about this, pull this out of here real quick. It's recommended that you apply a little bit of oil to the O-ring. They say new oil is good. I'll just actually use the old filter to apply it. So I do this for a couple reasons. One is I want to make sure that the filter is the exact filter that goes on here. And one of the ways I can do that is just by inspecting them and mating the surfaces together. This will transfer a little bit of oil to the new O-ring, and that oil helps the filter go on, kind of lubricates that process, and then allows it to expand between the filter and the engine mating surface. Okay. So there are times when maybe you get the wrong filter. It might have a different diameter thread in the middle, and it might have, you know, a different ring on it. Maybe you were sold the wrong one. This step helps make sure that doesn't happen. So you can inspect that. I see that they made up pretty nicely, so I'm not worried about that. If they didn't and you put it on, you could have oil just gushing out from your motor. And this is something I learned when I was a youngster changing oil, when someone brought me a filter that was wrong for their car. And yeah, that's exactly what happened, just hemorrhaged oil. So let's not do that, right? All right. So I'm gonna get that on there hand tight. And because I might have a little bit of oil in my hands, I might not be getting it as tight as possible, so I'm gonna take as much oil as I can off to get as good a grip as possible. But really hand tight is sufficient. You might see like hand tight plus a quarter turn or something like that written on the instructions. But as long as you have decent grip strength, get it on as tight as you can by hand, and that's going to be sufficient. All right, there we go. All right, so that's all buttoned up. We've got our drain plug in, we've got our oil filter on, and then we'll go to the other side. We'll talk about putting oil in and talk about oil specific. Okay, oil. Well, there's one tool I left out earlier, a funnel. Funnel is super helpful. I like these paper ones. I can just chuck them. I don't have to worry about cleaning them out. I want to contaminate anything at any point. So being able to just toss them, they're cheap, that works for me. All right, as oil goes, motorcycles, those with a wet clutch, which is almost all motorcycles, are going to use a motorcycle specific oil. They have additives in them to make sure that your clutch is performing correctly, because this oil is swarming around in there too. Now, I've heard people say, I've been riding motorcycles for 30 years and I use diesel oil and that's just fine, never had a problem. Well, you can do that if you want. And the day that Suzuki or Triumph or any other large manufacturer calls for diesel oil, that's the day I do it. But until then, motorcycle specific oil. Now, the SV manual calls for 1040 and 10W40 specifically is what it says. I'm using 10W50, and we'll get into a little bit about what that means. So first, the W actually doesn't stand for weight, it stands for winter. And the number in front of it and the number behind it are about viscosity. So the lower the number, the less viscosity it has, meaning that it flows easier. And the higher the number, the thicker it is more viscous. And the reason that they're like this is that in the winter, basically anytime it's cold out, you want a thinner motor oil that's gonna get up and move in your engine as quickly as possible. that lubricates things and minimizes the wear that is coming from a cold start where there's not necessarily oil around the piston rings and whatnot. So that's what that's about. And then the other number is, of course, when it's hot. So this is the rating at 210 degrees. So I run that crap out of this engine. It's always up and high in the rev range. I'm shifting at 9.5 or 10,000 RPM. And that I want to make sure that my oil is thick enough to be lubricating it properly. So 1040 is probably just fine. I'm gonna use a 1050. I use this actually in both of my bikes, and specifically Castrol Power One. The brand you use, it really doesn't make any difference to an extent. As long as it's a major brand, I would feel comfortable using it in my bike. So let's get started with that. Oh, that is on there. I don't know. Good job, Chris. There we go. So let's remove the cap. Now, as I said earlier, it uses 2.4 quarts, according to the manual. So there is going to be still a little bit of oil in there, probably not a measurable amount really. And also we have the oil filter, which holds a certain amount of oil. Now when we pour it in, that oil is not going to make it to the filter necessarily. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep an eye on the sight glass here. We've got our full and low lines, and we're going to pour it till we get it up to the F, and then we'll inspect it later. A little trick I like to do is to poke two holes in these, one at the top, one at the bottom, if you're holding it this way. Allows air in, prevents glugging, so the air hole can be nice and small, and you can make a much larger hole for pouring it. I know instinctively a lot of people want to pour this direction. The reason the spout is offset is so you can do it the opposite way, so that you can reduce the glugging, allow the air to go back into the container. Now this is the first quart. I don't need to worry about overfilling it. 2.4. You don't have to worry about that at all for the first 2 quarts. Let's see if I can show you how easily that just pours in right there. As much as we can, practically. And it's not a bad idea to open all of them. This one was already open, I can see that, so that might be my 0.4 right there. I'll go with the full one first. All right, I've got 2 quarts in there, and I can see about halfway between full and low. So I'm gonna go ahead, grab my partial, and keep an eye on that sight glass. All right, so with the motorcycle, it's not quite like a car. With the dipstick tells you it's exactly a quart low. We'll keep an eye on this. And I'm right to the top level there. Okay. Now, I fully expect to be adding more oil into this in a bit. So what I'm going to do is start the bike. Obviously, I'm going to put the cap back on before I do that. Start the bike, let it run only briefly. It does not need to get hot again. Just enough to circulate the oil into the filter. And then we'll check it again. closer look there, you can see that it's at a beyond low level after just running it. And that's purely from the oil going into the filter. We will keep our eye on the sight glass periodically. All right, I'm halfway between low and full, so a little bit more. Now you could say, well, it's supposed to be exactly 2.4, right? Well, give or take, right? Let's try to be as exact as we can and use the sight glass. All right, just gotta top it off just a slightly more oil. All right, and there we have it. Make sure you put your cap back on. And that is the extent of it. Next, we're going to start it up again, and we're going to double check for any leaks that may be occurring around the filter or the drain plug. As long as that's good, we're good. All right, so the last thing, dispose of your oil responsibly. It varies on what you do in different parts of the country. For me personally, I have to pour this into a milk jug, and then I can leave that with my recycling. Some things you need to take to a hazardous waste facility. Anyway, just make sure that you don't, put this down the drain or something like that. I know here it would go right to the river, pollute it, poison fish, and all sorts of things. So take care of it responsibly, and you've done a good job. All right, thanks for coming.